Just 200 giant corporations dominate a quarter of the world's economic activity. General Motors is now bigger than Denmark. Ford is bigger than South Africa. Unseen by shoppers in the high street, the famous brands of almost everything from running shoes to baby clothes are now made in very poor countries with cheap labor, at times bordering on a form of slave labor. Tiger Woods, the golfer, is paid more money to promote Nike than most of the entire workforce actually making Nike products here in Indonesia.
What we're actually seeing is precisely the opposite processes in train, that the poor are becoming markedly poorer, while the very wealthy are becoming staggeringly wealthy.
Made in Indonesia. Young people living here who make the famous brands are paid on average the equivalent of 72 pence a day, about $1. That's the legal minimum wage in Indonesia.
With the people is the fact that the corporations and the superpower are using more and more fabricated propaganda. People can now see through the spin. People know they cannot believe anymore what is said. And the people are starting to withdraw their support. They're starting to say, no, a government that only protects the Pepsi and the Coke and the McDonald's is not our government.
Pasang sama sekali, bahkan peraturan perusahaan pun tidak ada yang dipasang di tingkatan pabrik.
Nggak ada. Nggak usah kode etik. Peraturan di dalam perusahaan itu nggak pernah dilihatin dengan kami, apalagi kode etik dari suatu barang.
These boxer shorts were made in one of the factories we investigated. Before we left London, we bought a pair at a Gap store in Oxford Street for £8. Out of that £8, an Indonesian worker gets less than 4 pence. It's the same for running shoes that sell for £100. Out of that £100, a worker gets around 40 pence. That wouldn't even buy the laces.
Ya kami kaget, benar-benar ya. Oh, ternyata kami dalam satu celana ini kami bisa menguntungkan pengusaha begitu banyak, apalagi ribuan celana. Sehari minimal kami harus menghasilkan 3.000 celana. Itu minimal.
The corporate takeover of Indonesia. It was attended by the most powerful businessmen in the world, such as David Rockefeller. The giants of Western capitalism were represented. The oil companies, the banks, General Motors, British Leyland, ICI, British American Tobacco, Lehman Brothers, American Express, Siemens. Across the table were Indonesian leaders approved by General Suharto. For Western business, it was the start of the gold rush, which later became known as globalization. With the economy collapsed and Indonesia on the verge of revolution, Suharto was forced to step down, having already stolen an estimated $15 billion. During his reign of more than 30 years, Suharto had handed out public utilities to his family and cronies. They owned most of the national power grid. Nothing was overlooked, from TV stations to a monopoly on taxis. Driving from Jakarta Airport, you even paid a toll to Suharto's daughter. These unfinished buildings are monuments to a corruption on a scale unheard of in modern Asia, to what the World Bank called the miracle economy.
I think the issue of violence, which we're constantly asked about, is our main way in. I think that
in the weeks and days leading up to May Day in London, the police and the government orchestrated a propaganda campaign. The aim clearly was to alienate the public from the demonstrators by representing them collectively as violent and by suppressing the very issues that have public support.
The limits of tolerance are passed when protesters, in the name of some spurious cause, seek to inflict fear, terror, violence and criminal damage on our people and property.
The key to these things is actually getting mass amounts of people involved, because the media will put one point of view across time and time again, you know, the mindless hooligan side. But when you think about the mass redundancies, the poverty, the starvation, the literal raping of a country through third world debt and what have you, you know, that is violence on a huge scale. It's genocide.
And when May Day came, 6,000 police turned part of London's West End into a giant detention camp.
We managed to stop the implementation of a crazy idea called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, which would have allowed corporations to sue governments for the removal of any law which they didn't like. Now, that was being promoted, that idea, by the 29 most powerful countries on Earth. It was being promoted by all the major multinational corporations and all the big institutions such as the World Trade Organization, and a ragged band of dissenters around the world.
The rich get richer on running up debt, cheap labor and paying as little tax as possible, while the poor get poorer as their jobs and public services are cut back in order to pay just the interest on debt owed by their governments to the World Bank.
When the Indonesian rupiah collapsed from being roughly 2,500 rupiah to the dollar to being what it is now, 10,000 rupiah to the dollar, the costs to Nike for each Indonesian laborer was cut to 25% of what it had been. And Nike got a great discount on Indonesian labor as a result, and did not unilaterally raise Indonesian wages to the same standard they had been prior to the devaluation of the rupiah.
We simply don't know what that number is.
Here's your own internal report, August 97. I quote, "We estimate that at least 20 to 30% of Government of Indonesia development budget funds will payments to government staff and politicians."
That number was plucked out of the air. Lots of times we have to guess with numbers, and the person who wrote that was guessing. Somebody comes up with a number and it gets recycled. But
a lot of money.
I don't want to dismiss the issue. Just let's not get hung up on one figure which isn't particularly hard. I think non-economists get it wrong a lot more often than economists.
Otomatis ya kita serahin diri sama Tuhan aja deh. Yang jelas mungkin berobat pun kayaknya nggak bisa. Jadi kita pasrah apa adanya. Pusingnya bukan kepalang. Ya kalau seandainya saya sakit gitu nggak bisa masuk kerja, ya udah apa boleh buat. Paling kita bisa cari pinjaman buat berobat anak gitu. Nanti setelah kita kerja lagi baru kita. Jadi akhir bulan itu mesti harus transfusi darah.
I think non-economists get it wrong a lot more often than economists.
Ever heard of a situation like this for any country where global capital essentially holds a meeting with state and hammers out the conditions of their own entry into the country? The conference went on for 3 days. The first day was when the Indonesians spoke and essentially made their case. They divided into 5 different sections on the second day. Sectoral meetings, mining in one room, food services, light industry in another, banking and finance in another, Chase Manhattan was there, and simultaneously they hammered out policies that were going to be acceptable to these global investors on a sector-by-sector basis. With each of the people going around the table saying, this is what we need to see, this, and they basically designed the legal infrastructure for investment in Indonesia.
The rich get richer on running up debt, cheap labor and paying as little tax as possible, while the poor get poorer as their jobs and public services are cut back in order to pay just the interest on debt owed by their governments to the World Bank. Just 200 giant corporations dominate a quarter of the world's economic activity.